Right now, there are more than 8 billion of us. We've been to the bottom of the ocean and the surface of the moon. We've named every mammal bigger than a house cat and quite a few smaller. We are, by any measure a biologist would use, an absurdly successful species, spread across every continent, every climate, every altitude short of the death zone on Everest. It is frankly hard to imagine a version of the world where humans just don't make it. But that version of the world nearly happened. More than once, not in some speculative what if an asteroid hits us way. In a documented, written into our genome, we can still see the scar tissue way. And the evidence isn't buried in some myth or prophecy. It's sitting inside your own cells right now, in the DNA you're using to read this sentence, patiently waiting for someone with the right software to go looking for it. Let's start with the strange one. In 2023, a team of geneticists ran a new kind of statistical model, something called FitCol, built to reconstruct population sizes way further back in time than older tools could manage. They fed it genetic data from over 3,000 people alive today, African and non-African populations both, and asked it to work backward, not to what our ancestors looked like, to how many of them there were. The answer came back strange enough that they checked it twice. Somewhere between roughly 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, our ancestral population appears to have collapsed to about 1,280 breeding individuals, not 1,280,000. 1,280 full stop, roughly the head count of a small high school, standing in for the entire future of the human lineage. And this wasn't a bad week. The model suggests this lasted for something like 117,000 years. For context, that's longer than Homo sapiens as a species has existed at all. Sit with that for a second. For over 100,000 years, essentially the entire future of humanity was riding on a population smaller than most sports stadiums, generation after generation after generation, with no way of knowing it was happening and no guarantee it would end. Now, I want to be upfront about something, because this is where it gets interesting, rather than just terrifying. Not everyone agrees this happened the way the model says. Other researchers have gone back through the same data with different methods and come away suspicious that what looks like a bottleneck might actually be a statistical artifact, a quirk of how the tool handles ancient migration patterns rather than a real physical collapse in headcount. Population genetics working this far back in time is a bit like trying to reconstruct a car crash from the tyre tracks a million years after the road got repaved. The signal is real. What exactly it's a signal of is still being argued over in journals right now, but here's what nobody disputes. Something happened around then. The timing lines up almost too neatly with one of the strangest events in our evolutionary history. The moment two separate chromosomes fused together into what's now human chromosome 2. Every other great ape has 48 chromosomes. We have 46. Somewhere in that same rough window, our lineage's genetic architecture itself got rearranged right around the time our numbers may have created. Cause, effect, coincidence. Take your pick, because the honest answer is scientists aren't sure yet. And even the something happened part isn't as settled as it sounds. Researchers digging back through the fossil record for that same window, 813,000 to 930,000 years ago, keep finding evidence that early human species were living across an awful lot of the planet at the time. Sites in China, Kenya, Ethiopia, Italy, Spain, the UK. If a population really had crashed down to a head count you could fit in a school gymnasium, you might expect the fossil record to go quiet somewhere, at least for a while. Instead, it looks almost suspiciously busy. One explanation is that the crash was real but localized, devastating to one lineage in one region while others carried on elsewhere, invisible to a model that's only looking at modern human ancestry. Another is that the model is picking up something else entirely, dressed up to look like a crash. Both explanations are still on the table, and the people who found the fossils and the people who ran the model are, at this point, essentially staring at each other across the evidence. If that bottleneck feels too abstract, too deep in prehistory to really land, here's one that's easier to picture, because we can watch the rock that, maybe, did it. About 74,000 years ago, a volcano in what's now northern Sumatra didn't just erupt. It went off with a force so large, it's hard to describe using the word eruption at all. Toba ejected somewhere in the ballpark of 2,800 cubic kilometres of material, enough by some comparisons to bury the entire United States under more than a foot of ash. Ash from that single event has been found as far away as India, China, and the floor of the Arabian Sea, a layer of fine white dust settling over an area roughly the size of the continental United States, sometimes more than a foot deep, thousands of kilometres from the source. To put the scale in perspective, Mount Pinatubo's eruption in 1991, the one that measurably cooled the entire planet for about a year and painted sunsets red across 3 continents, ejected somewhere around 10 cubic kilometres of material. Toba put out roughly 280 times that. It's not really a bigger version of a volcano you've heard of. It's a different category of event, one we haven't seen a repeat of in the entire span of recorded human history. For decades, the leading theory, the Toba catastrophe hypothesis, held that this eruption triggered a volcanic winter so severe it nearly ended us. Global temperatures dropping, years of failed harvests, if you can even call foraging a harvest, human population already thin and scattered crashing down to somewhere between 10 and 30,000 people worldwide. Global, total, 10 to 30,000. It's a genuinely great story. It's vivid, it's cinematic, it fits the vibe of one bad day nearly erased our species. And for a long time, it was the explanation you'd find in almost every textbook chapter on human origins. It's also, according to a growing pile of more recent evidence, probably not quite what happened. Archaeologists digging at sites blanketed in actual Toba ash, not theoretical ash, the real stuff still in the ground, keep finding tools, continuously. Before the eruption, during it, after it. In India, people were apparently still napping stone and going about their business with volcanic dust falling around them. Climate models have gotten more sophisticated too, and the newer ones suggest the cooling wasn't the uniform global catastrophe once assumed. Parts of the northern hemisphere may have dropped several degrees, sure, but much of the southern hemisphere barely flinched. The genetic bottleneck is very likely real. The idea that Toba personally caused it is looking shakier every year, and these two aren't even the only candidates on the table. Geneticists have flagged other smaller dips in the record too. A possible squeeze around the time modern humans first pushed out of Africa. Another hinted at during the depths of the last ice age, when glaciers locked up so much of the planet's water that entire coastlines we'd recognise today simply didn't exist yet. None of these are as dramatic as a 98% die-off, but stack them up and a pattern starts to emerge. Our species doesn't have one origin story where we scraped by. We seem to have several, spaced out across hundreds of thousands of years, each one a separate roll of the dice that could have come up differently, which leaves us in a strange spot, honestly. We're now fairly confident our species nearly vanished at least twice, possibly more, and we're not entirely sure why any of those times. There's something almost unsettling about that. We like our extinction stories to have a villain. An asteroid, a supervolcano, something with a name and a date you can point to on a timeline, something you could theoretically have seen coming and dodged. What the evidence increasingly suggests instead is quieter and stranger. A species scraping by for tens of thousands of years on numbers too small to feel safe, undone by nothing more dramatic than a shifting climate, and a run of bad luck long enough to count in geological time rather than a human lifetime. No comet, no single cataclysmic afternoon anyone could have pointed a camera at. Just generation after generation doing the ordinary work of staying alive, finding water, finding food, raising children who'd go on to do the same, without any way of knowing how close to the edge they actually were, because the edge in this case wasn't a cliff. It was a slope so gradual it took hundreds of thousands of years and a supercomputer to even notice it had happened at all. That's the part that stays with me, honestly. Every disaster movie ever made assumes you'd know. Sirens, red skies, a scientist yelling at a general. But the two closest calls we can actually point to in our own species' history didn't look like anything while they were happening. They looked like an ordinary Tuesday repeated for a few thousand generations in a row, which raises the only question that really matters here. Not what almost killed us, but how would we even know if it were happening again? Slowly, quietly, right now. Too gradual for anyone alive today to be the one who notices. Warning, this one's a brain bender. In this video, we're talking about the biggest mysteries in history scientists still can't explain. The Voynich manuscript is a fat, vellum-bound puzzle from the 15th century that looks like someone built a book in an alien language and then illustrated it with impossible plans. Open it and you'll find pages of looping script that refuses to match any known tongue, diagrams of strange zodiac-like wheels, and botanical plates showing flora that botanists can't place. Radiocarbon dating pins the vellum to the early 1400s, which only deepens the problem. It's old, it's real, and it's unreadable. The mystery's procedure is the steady accumulation of failure. Cryptographers, linguists, and hobbyists have fed the text into statistical analysis, pattern searches, and brute force code breaking for a century, and the results are maddeningly ambiguous. Some see structure that hints at a language. Others say it's an elaborate cipher. A few argue it's an intentional hoax. Every proposed key opens a new disagreement rather than the book itself. Culturally, Voynich occupies that rare space between artifact and myth. Scholars treat it like a research research project. The public treats it like a locked trunk full of secrets. The manuscript resists narrative. It gives you dates, ink, and plausible provenance, then slams the lid shut with an unreadable script. That stubborn silence is the point. Whatever it was meant to say, no one's earned the privilege of hearing it yet. Pyramids sit on the desert like questions carved in stone. Precise, massive, and maddeningly human. Giza's giants are the obvious headline. Limestone blocks weighing tons, aligned with surprising precision to cardinal points, laid in courses that still baffle casual measurement. How did a Bronze Age society move millions of stones, lift them into place, and maintain such accuracy without modern cranes or digital plans? That's the core problem. Engineering that looks both ingenious and underdocumented. Accounts of the procedure mix archaeology and theory. Excavations show organised labour, ramps of various designs, copper tools, and logistical records hinting at supply chains and workforce housing. Evidence against wild alien stories, yes, but not a full blueprint. Different teams propose straight ramps, spirals, internal mechanisms, or clever levering. Each model solves some issues and creates others. Experimental archaeology moves blocks and tests hypotheses, but scaling remains the rub. Small demonstrations don't always account for millions of blocks and centuries of alignment. Culturally, the pyramids are multifunctional. Tombs, statements of kingship, astronomical markers, and living propaganda. Their endurance fuels myth. If humans could build the pyramids, what else could they have known? That ambiguity invites everything from meticulous scholarship to conspiracy. The pyramids' real mystery is less who built them, and more how close were those builders to losing the recipe. The silence in the mortar keeps the debate alive. Cow's hum is less a monster and more a private, low-frequency itch that won't stop. Imagine living in a quiet New Mexico valley and hearing every now and then a distant diesel rumble that nobody else admits to hearing, except a scattered few. That's the hum, a persistent low bass noise reported by residents in Taos and a handful of other places worldwide. It's maddeningly local and maddeningly stubborn. Reports follow a similar procedure. Someone notices a noise, asks neighbours, finds half a dozen with the same complaint, and a dozen more who hear nothing. Scientists arrive with microphones and spectrum analyzers, set up equipment in bedrooms and orchards, and often record nothing conclusive. Medical teams screen sufferers for tinnitus, auditory processing issues, and stress. Some cases correlate with health or environment, others don't. Acoustic surveys sometimes pick up industrial or traffic sources, sometimes they don't. Culturally, the hum becomes a community glue and a fissure at once. Support groups form, local law grows, property values wobble, and conspiracy forums fill in the blanks. The experience is intimate. Late night keeping watch, neighbours trading theories, the sound becoming a symbol for being singled out by the world. Whether it's geophysical noise, a collective psychosomatic echo, or something else entirely, the hum's cruelty is procedural. It teases definable data, then vanishes when you try to pin it down, leaving only the memory of a sound that may never be proven to exist. The Zodiac ciphers are part code, part dare. Cryptic puzzles sent to newspapers by a killer who loved the spotlight. He mailed taunting letters sprinkled with symbols and promises, including ciphers that he claimed would reveal his identity. The procedure was theatrical. A postcard here, a cipher there, deadlines and veiled threats. Newsrooms printed them, amateur sleuths and professional cryptanalysts pored over them, and the killer watched the public sweat. Some ciphers yielded meat. The 408-symbol cipher was cracked within days in 1969, revealing a gloating mix of bragging and mythology. Others resisted. The 340-character cipher, unsolved for 51 years, became an obsession. Hundreds of people running statistical analyses, frequency counts, and machine learning attempts. A breakthrough finally came in 2020 when researchers announced a partial solution, but key messages remain disputed, and some shorter ciphers still defy confident decoding. Beyond the symbols is the human procedure, victims, timelines, and a man who staged mystery as performance. The ciphers did more than hide a name. They amplified terror, forcing ordinary readers into the role of detective and giving the killer narratives to feed on. Even if every code were open tomorrow, the broader puzzle would stay: the identity, motive, and psychological shape of the Zodiac. For now, the letters keep a taunting blank where answers should be, and that deliberate silence is part of the terror. In August 1977, a radio telescope at Ohio State University blinked at the sky and recorded a spike that made a volunteer scribble, "Wow," in the margins. A strong narrowband radio burst centered on the hydrogen line, lasting 72 seconds, coming from a patch of heavens with no obvious star to blame. The "wow" signal is a clean billboard-sized data point that refuses to be boring. Procedure is deliciously simple. Scan the sky, detect a burst far above background noise, check again, nothing. The Big Ear telescope's dual-feed design saw saw the signal in one beam but not the follow-up, which suggests a localized transient source. Astronomers checked catalogues, ruled out satellites, pulsars, and known radio sources, and still the number sat stubbornly unexplained. Over the years, people proposed comets, microwave leakage, alien origin, or a bizarre instrumental glitch. Each theory fits a corner of the evidence and fails elsewhere. Culturally, the wow. Signal is a lesson in constraint. A single clean anomaly ignites enormous inference. It's the closest clean whisper we have that isn't backed by repetition, the basic requirement for scientific confirmation. That fleeting 72-second note sits at the edge between hope and skepticism, tantalizing, unrepeatable, and perfectly tailored to feed both dreams of contact and the sober patience of science. The sky gave us a hint, then shut up. We're still listening. The Bermuda Triangle is a patch of ocean where compasses wobble and stories of disappearance hang thicker than the humidity. Imagine a clear sky crossing, sudden radio static, a pilot's last terse transmission, and then nothing. Ship, plane, all gone as if swallowed by a clean hole in the map. That's the triangle's law. Vanishings clustered between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico that fueled magazines, books, and late-night speculation. Reports follow a pattern. A vessel or aircraft fails to arrive, search teams find no debris or bodies, and headlines invent patterns faster than investigators can test them. Popular explanations pile up: rogue waves, methane hydrates erupting from the seafloor, magnetic anomalies upsetting navigation, pilot error, and unpredictable weather. Many high-profile cases that fed the myth have plausible, prosaic causes once re-examined. Navigational mistakes, storms misjudged, or simple reporting errors blown into mystery by sensationalism. Scientists and the Coast Guard treat the region like any other busy stretch of ocean. Dense traffic plus hurricane-prone weather equals more accidents. But culturally, the triangle functions as a blank space monster, a place where maps politely admit ignorance and storytellers can paste a supernatural label. The real pull is narrative economy. One neat zone explains disparate tragedies. Even when data erases the paranormal gloss, the image of a charted hole in the world persists, comforting, frightening, and stubbornly resistant to being entirely mapped away. Roanoke is a disappearance that reads like a headline clipped from a nightmare. 115 colonists, including women and children, arrive in 1587. Within a few years, gone. Governor John White returns from a resupply trip to find the settlement deserted, houses dismantled, no bodies, and a single carved word on a palisade post: Croatoan. That word is the ghost at the center of every theory. The procedural trail is maddeningly tidy and maddeningly empty. There are clues: a cleared fort, carved letters, reports of smoke seen on nearby islands, but no smoking gun. Did they relocate to Croatoan Island, modern Hatteras, and integrate with local tribes? Were they abducted, killed in a raid, or wiped out by disease and starvation? Archaeology has turned up hints: European artifacts at coastal native sites, post holes matching English layouts, but nothing that conclusively names a fate or maps a final mark. Culturally, Roanoke became a Rorschach. Early English propaganda about failed colonization, later American origin myth fodder, and a refuge for speculative scenarios from assassination to secret evacuation. The procedural gap, well-documented departure, inexplicable absence, and a single cryptic carving lets every theory lean on imagination. That carved word is a conversation starter that never finished its sentence. For centuries, people have mapped possibilities over that blank spot. Colony silence still feels deliberate, like someone left a note and walked off into a history that refuses to answer. The Nazca lines are giant drawings scratched into the Peruvian desert. Birds, monkeys, spiders, and long straight lines so perfectly laid out they look designed for an audience in the sky. From ground level, they're barely visible. From above, they resolve into enormous, deliberate figures etched across a plateau that hasn't changed much for 1,000 years. That scale is the core puzzle. Why make art meant to be seen from a vantage few people could access before aircraft? Procedure here is both simple and spectacular. The Nazca removed the dark, iron-rich surface stones to reveal lighter earth beneath, creating high contrast lines that survive because the desert is hyper-arid and wind still. Creating the giant figures required planning, grids, stakes, sight lines, and communal labour. But the why is slippery. Theories range from astronomical calendars and ritual pathways to water-related rites, processional lines leading to springs, and offerings to gods. Each hypothesis fits some geoglyphs and not others. The line's variety resists a single explanation. Culturally, the Nazca play the role of deliberate mystery, engineering without a clear social record, art that demands interpretation. They're a message with an uncertain audience, devotional map, agricultural protocol, or giant prayer. Until someone finds a Nazca voice that reads these marks, the plateau remains a silent auditorium where humans long ago staged something enormous and left us the axe comes down and a man's collarbone stops existing. Another steps up to take his place and the axe is already moving again. Behind the axeman, planks are cracking under the weight of everyone trying to reach him at once, and none of them can. because the bridge is 3 men wide and he is standing in the middle of all 3 lanes at the same time. Somewhere behind him, his own army is falling apart in the open field, and he is the only reason the English haven't finished the job yet. He has no name that anyone bothered to record. He has a helmet, a chest full of scavenged mail, and by this point an English corpse for every plank he's standing on. This is the Battle of Stamford Bridge, September 1066, and the man in the middle of it has already been fighting alone for longer than he should have survived. The Saxon army under King Harold caught the Vikings scattered, half their force on the wrong side of the river, unarmoured, unprepared, being cut down where they stood. The rest should have died with them. They didn't, because one man decided the bridge ends here and made it true through sheer refusal to move, for long enough that the Vikings on the far bank had time to do the one thing that might save them, form a wall. It didn't save him. The chronicles claim it eventually took a Saxon soldier floating underneath the bridge in a barrel, spearing up through the gaps in the planks, to finally put him down, which is either the most resourceful kill in medieval warfare or the detail a storyteller adds 2 centuries later because he just got tired isn't a good enough ending. Probably both. He is not the last man history is going to ask to do this. 5.5 centuries earlier, another man had already done this on a different river. Horatius Cocles. Rome, 508 BCE. An Etruscan army under Lars Porsena is pouring toward the one bridge into the city, and behind him work crews are hacking through the pilings, trying to drop the whole structure into the Tiber before the enemy reaches the far bank. He has one working eye, the other lost long before this day. Nobody bothered to record how, which means half the world simply doesn't exist for him. The first man who tries him works that out the hard way, comes in fast on Horatius's blind side, certain he's found the opening, and never sees the shield rim that meets his jaw before his sword is even level. He goes down off the edge of the bridge into the water. Horatius hasn't turned his head. He didn't need to. A man attacking from a direction you can't see still has to stand somewhere, and there's only one angle the bridge lets him come from. 2 other soldiers are holding the crossing with him, but the planks are giving way fast now, cracked loose one at a time behind all 3 of them, and Horatius sends the other 2 back across while he's still killing. A spear comes for his ribs, and he turns it wide with his shield boss and puts his own blade through the gap it leaves. Another man swings for his skull and only clips the helmet and pays for the miss immediately. By the time the last support beam finally cracks, he's alone on what's left of the bridge. The whole Etruscan vanguard stacked up at the far end, unable to reach him more than one at a time, and he doesn't wait to see whether the timber holds. He drops into the current in full armour, weapons and all, and swims for the far bank while the bridge, and everyone still on it, goes into the Tiber behind him. Notice the mechanism repeating already, twice 2,500 years apart. It's not superhuman strength doing the work in either story, it's geometry. A bridge doesn't care how big your army is, it only lets a few men fight at a time. An army is a number, a battle is a doorway. China gives us a case with far better sourcing. Dian Wei, bodyguard to the warlord Cao Cao, at the Battle of Wancheng in 197 CE. Cao Cao's camp is overrun in a surprise night attack. Tents on fire, horses loose, men still finding their weapons in the dark while enemy soldiers are already inside the perimeter. Dian Wei, according to the records of the 3 kingdoms, not folk memory, grabs weapons from the fallen and holds the gate alone so his commander can escape, fighting until his spear breaks, then his sword, and finally when he's out of everything else, using 2 enemy corpses as clubs before he's overwhelmed. He dies. It's not a rescue story with a twist ending where he makes it out. It's a delaying action, and it worked exactly as delaying actions are supposed to. Cao Cao survived the war, and decades later went on to found one of the 3 kingdoms that gave the era its name. Dian Wei didn't get an epilogue. He got a gate. Smaller scale now, and a story most people outside Scandinavia have never heard. The Laverta Bridge, Finland, 1808, Russo-Swedish War. A Swedish column is pulling back under pressure, and one soldier, sometimes named Zacharias Bong in the folk telling, a big, slow-witted man the rest of the unit reportedly wrote off as useless, is left behind to cover the crossing while everyone else falls back. He ends up alone on the bridge against advancing Russian troops, and instead of being brushed aside in the first minute like everyone expected, holds the span by main force, buying enough time for the retreat to actually work, and for reinforcements to arrive. The historical record is thinner here, and the details shift depending which version you read, which is exactly what a story looks like halfway between event and legend. One foot still in the documents, one already in the ballad. It got turned into a poem. Sven Duva, decades later, and the poem is honestly better remembered than the man. Now the paperwork gets a lot more solid, because we jump into an era with medal citations and eyewitness statements taken under oath. Alvin York, Argonne Forest, October 1918. His patrol walks into a German machine gun position and gets shredded, most of his unit killed or pinned in the opening minute. York, a Tennessee marksman and a man who tried to get out of the draft on religious grounds, ends up more or less alone against the position, picking off German gunners one at a time with a rifle, then holding off a bayonet charge with a pistol, using a trick he'd learned hunting turkeys back home. Shoot the ones in back first so the ones in front don't know to scatter. By the time it's over, he and the handful of survivors from his unit have taken 132 German prisoners. One man's Sunday school aim, applied to a battlefield, is somehow the least metaphorical entry on this list. Fast forward to January 1945, the Colmar Pocket, France. Audie Murphy, a farm kid from Texas who was rejected by the Marines and the Navy for being too small and got into the army only after lying about his age, watches 6 German tanks and a couple hundred infantry advance on his company's position, orders his men back to the tree line, and then, rather than following them, climbs onto a burning, abandoned tank destroyer that could go up in flames at any second. He single-handedly holds off the advancing force for close to an hour using its mounted machine gun, standing in the open on top of a vehicle that's already on fire beneath him, calling in artillery on his own position by field phone, while he does it because the Germans are close enough that there's no other way to stop them. When the gun finally jams and the ammunition runs out, he climbs down and walks away wounded rather than being carried. He'd go on to become one of the most decorated American combat soldiers of the entire war, and then oddly a movie star, which means the guy who actually did this later got paid to reenact slightly smaller versions of it for a camera. April 1945, and things get almost absurd. Leo Major, a one-eyed Canadian sniper who'd already lost the eye to a phosphorus grenade and refused to be sent home for it, is scouting the Dutch city of Zwolle with one other soldier when his partner is killed. Rather than retreat and report back, Major decides to take the city. Alone, he moves block to block through the dark, firing from doorways and alleys and shifting position after every burst, so the echoes make it sound like a whole squad is moving through the streets, capturing German soldiers in 2s and 3s along the way, and talking a group of drunk SS officers into surrendering at a bar. Then he sets fire to the SS headquarters itself, which is the detail that finally convinces the garrison commander he's facing a full Canadian advance, rather than one man with a grudge. And by morning the Germans have withdrawn and Zwolle is liberated, by one very tired, very furious man with one eye and an idea. The Dutch still mark the anniversary. Last stop, 1948. The newly partitioned subcontinent, the mountains above Tithwal in Kashmir. Piru Singh, a company Havildar major in the Indian Army, is leading an assault on a fortified ridge when the men around him start falling to machine gun fire. He keeps going alone, clearing one enemy post with a grenade, taking a head wound, and charging the next post anyway before he's killed at point-blank range. His unit takes the ridge behind him. He's awarded the Param Veer Chakra, India's highest military honour, posthumously, a medal literally named Wheel of the Ultimate Brave, instituted only the year before, and he's among its first recipients, which means the newest country on this list already had, within a year of independence, a name for exactly this kind of death. Warning, this one's a deep dive into nightmarish seas. In this video we are talking about the scariest myths in history. Picture a midnight ocean so black it swallows your lantern whole. Suddenly the water boils, ropes snap, something the size of an island drags the keel under. That's the Kraken, a leviathan of North Atlantic sailors' lore, a living whirlpool of tentacles that could wrap, crush and vanish an entire ship in minutes. Early accounts treat it like a natural horror. Giant squid sightings, colossally misread, turned into a creature with a vengeance. Later tales dress it up as punishment, the sea's answer to hubris. The procedural terror of Kraken stories comes in slow escalation. First a strange bump, then a sail torn clean off, then men screaming as arms like trees rip through decks. Authors love the sensory details, the stench of brine, the oily suction on wooden planks, the grinding of barnacle-hard flesh against hull. It's theatre. Whale hunt becomes cosmic ambush. What's wild is how the Kraken functions culturally. For seafarers it explained sudden loss, storms, and the abyssal unknown. For storytellers it provided motive, hunger, defense, or simply the ocean's cruelty. Modern science shrinks the beast, but the fear remains. Deep, cold, patient, the kind that makes sailors whisper prayers to wooden gods before crossing a dark horizon. Chapter 2. Witchcraft. Witchcraft is less a single monster and more a contagious fear that metastasized across Europe and colonial America. Imagine a rumor starting in a market, a bad harvest, a sudden death, a newborn who won't stop crying, and then watch it bloom into accusations that could ruin a life. The witch in these stories is a catch-all scapegoat, healer, outcast, midwife, eccentric neighbour. Once accused, ritualised terror did the rest. The mechanics are painfully bureaucratic and theatrical. Neighbours swear vague oaths, magistrates commission tests, the infamous ducking, the search for witches' marks, confessions are pried out under pain or promise. Trials mixed superstition, legalism and spectacle, public hangings, burnings and humiliations that doubled as entertainment and moral lessons. Sensory details linger, the stink of torch smoke, the rustle of straw as bodies fell, whispered prayers turned thin with fear. Culturally, witchcraft served as an explanation for the inexplicable and a tool for social control. It targeted the vulnerable, elderly women, dissenters, anyone who stepped outside narrow norms. Even after skepticism grew, the legacy stayed. Trials, pamphlets, and a language of suspicion that resurfaced in new forms whenever societies panicked. The myth of witchcraft wasn't about demons alone. It was about how communities police fear. Chapter 3. The Wendigo. The Wendigo is a cold, hungry thing, a winter spirit from Algonquian traditions that embodies starvation, greed, and the terror of isolation. Picture a gaunt figure with stretched skin, yellowed eyes, and an appetite that no meal will ever sate. But the Wendigo is more than a monster. It's a caution stitched into folklore. Don't let hunger hollow you into something inhuman. Stories vary. In some versions, the Wendigo is a distinct being, hunting travelers in blizzard. In others, a person who resorts to cannibalism becomes possessed, transformed from neighbour into predator. The procedural creep of Wendigo tales is gradual. First odd behaviour, then whispers of theft, then the final impossible hunger. Sensory details emphasise winter, the brittle snap of frozen branches, the white glare that erases landmarks, the metallic taste of fear in your mouth as footprints vanish in fresh snow. Culturally, Wendigo stories police survival ethics and communal boundaries. In harsh winters, the myth discouraged hoarding and the taboo of consuming one's own. Later colonisation and sensationalist retellings flattened complex teachings into cheap horror. Modern media leans on the cannibal angle, but the original myth is a moral engine. A way communities warned, if scarcity strips away your humanity, something worse than death may take you. Chapter 4. The Penagalan. The Penagalan is a Southeast Asian maritime nightmare, an islander's warning about lonely nights at sea and stranger tides. Imagine a slow, shadowy shape slipping alongside a canoe, a pale, elongated face peering through the sting of rain, eyes like wet coins, a mouth that never quite closes. In some coastal provinces, the Penagalan is said to hunt fishermen and solitary travellers drawn to the scent of smoke from a lone fire or the flash of a lantern. Procedure in the tales is grotesquely intimate. The creature waits until the victim is asleep or isolated, then slides a long, thin proboscis or tongue into exposed orifices, ears, nose, mouth, sucking out warmth, breath, or blood in a silence that feels like being unmade. Other versions describe it as a night-roaming phantom that smears salt on doorways and spits whispering curses into hull planks so that boats drift aimless at dawn. The horror is in the quietness, no battle, just a slow, intimate taking while friends sleep unaware. Culturally, the Penagalan explains disappearances at sea and enforces social rules. Never travel alone at night, cover your fire, sleep in groups. As with many maritime myths, it mixes real dangers, storms, exposure, piracy, with personified fear. The Penagalan keeps communities vigilant. Better an ember and 2 oars than a story that leaves your name on a coastal shrine. Chapter 5. The Chupacabra. The Chupacabra is a modern myth with ancient appetite, a livestock predator born in late 20th century Latin America that quickly joined the folklore canon. Picture dawn on a rural ranch. Goats found drained, tiny puncture wounds at the throat, no footprints leading away. The creature's name, Goat Sucker, says the rest, and the image stuck. A reptilian spiky-backed thing or a mangy, vampire-like canine, depending on who's telling it. Tales follow a consistent procedure. Livestock discovered overnight, blood reportedly gone, neighbours whisper, someone out there prowls with surgical precision. Sightings balloon with every rumour-laced phone call and tabloid piece. Photos grainy, videos fuzzy, and every missing goat becomes a data point in the panic. Scientific explanations, parasites, coyotes, misidentified dogs, coexist uneasily with eyewitness terror because the Chupacabra thrives where certainty fails. Culturally, Chupacabra stories reveal anxieties about globalization, environmental change, and economic precarity. Ranchers losing stock, communities vulnerable to rumour, a monster that feeds on small livelihoods. Also a media age myth, quick to spread, quick to mutate. Whether scaly and alien or mangled and canine, the Chupacabra functions the same way. A convenient shape to point to when the dark eats your paycheck and your neighbours have answers you don't. Chapter 6. La Llorona. La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, is a ghost story that doubles as a moral and a warning across Hispanic cultures. Picture moonlight on a riverbank and the chill sound of a woman calling a child's name, except the voice folds into sobs and then silence. Versions vary. A scorned lover who drowns her children in a jealous rage, a grieving mother who lost her kids to fate, or a woman cursed to search rivers for children forever. The image is simple and relentless. Wet dress, hollow eyes, eyes, a cry that stops your blood. The procedural terror is theatrical and intimate. She's not a marauding beast. She's a presence that finds you at night at water's edge when the town is sleep quiet. Fathers use her tail to keep children from wandering. Lovers invoke her to explain sudden disappearances. The sensory details matter. Sodden fabric clinging to skin, the ghost breath on your neck, the slick sound of river pebbles underfoot. Every retelling tightens the knot. Culturally, La Llorona enforces social norms about motherhood, responsibility, and the dangers of transgression, but she's also a repository for collective grief, colonization, lost children, communities torn by violence. The story endures because it can be both cautionary and sorrowful. Horror fused to empathy, a ghost who terrifies and mourns in equal measure. Chapter 7. Black Shuck. Black Shuck is an English phantom hound that shows up like a thunderclap on a wet, lightning-slit night. A huge dog, coal black, eyes like burning coals, moving without sound until it's suddenly there on the churchyard path. Accounts cluster in East Anglia, parishioners bolting doors, bells tolling themselves, a deafening presence that leaves scorch marks on wood and mortal dread on the living. It's not just a spooky dog, it's an omen, a visible, violent sign that death or disaster is very near. Stories unfold with stagecraft. First the weather goes wrong, a squall, a flash of light. Then the hound appears, padding between pews, across rooftops, sometimes eating a flock's worth of sheep in a single, impossible path. Witnesses describe a smell of sulphur and a sensation like someone had walked through the room and unplugged warmth. In one famous account, parishioners swore the creature tore through a church, killing 2 people and leaving a black scorch mark on the door that remained for centuries. Culturally, Black Shuck embodies fear of sudden catastrophe. Storms, plague, war, made animal and moral. The dog could be a diabolical spy, a guardian of ancient curse, or simply a explaining shadow for tragic coincidence. That ambiguity is the point. Whether omen or predator, Black Shuck forces communities to read the weather as meaning and to believe that some nights are already decided before you ever step outside. Chapter 8. Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga is the Slavic forest witch who eats the unwary and runs a house that walks on chicken legs. A fairy tale nightmare dressed as a moral test. Picture a hut spinning in the clearing, bones for fence posts, pine needles crackling underfoot, and an old woman whose nose and appetite are equally sharp. She's both villain and guardian. Tricksters fail and are eaten. Clever travellers pass her tests and leave with magical aid. Tales follow a ritual choreography. The traveller approaches the hut and must call it by name. The fence of bones creaks open. The floorboards smell of mushrooms and iron. Baba Yaga might demand impossible tasks. Fetch water in a sieve, separate mixed grain, and watch closely for honesty, courage, or cunning. She cooks at a fire with a pestle and mortar that can fly. Her soup can be poison or providence depending on how you behave. The suspense is procedural. Succeed and you leave with a feathered cap or a map. Fail and the forest keeps your bone. Culturally, Baba Yaga enforces boundaries between civilized village life and the wild unknown. She encodes lessons about hospitality, reciprocity, and the respect owed to the uncanny powers of nature. Unlike tidy monsters, she's ambiguous, capable of cruelty and unexpected mercy, so her stories teach that the forest's rules are strict but just, and that survival often hinges on wit as much as virtue. In 2019, a team of archaeologists working in a cave high in the Bolivian Andes pulls a leather pouch out of a sealed rock crevice. The pouch is stitched together from 3 fox snouts sewn into a single container, and it's been sitting untouched for roughly 1,000 years. Inside they find a wooden tablet, a bundle of llama bone tubes, and a collection of small pouches. When they run the residue through a mass spectrometer back in the lab, the results don't make sense at first. This single kit contains traces of cocaine, DMT, harmine, bufotenine, and psilocin. That's 5 different psychoactive compounds drawn from at least 3 plants that don't grow anywhere near each other, carefully combined into one ritual bundle. Somebody 1,000 years ago wasn't just experimenting. They were running what is essentially a pharmacy. And that's not even the oldest evidence we have. Not close. Before we get into how humans found these substances, it's worth a quick detour, because we're not the only species that goes looking for a different state of mind. Reindeer in Siberia hunt down psychoactive mushrooms on purpose. Elephants will walk miles for fermented fruit. Dolphins have been filmed gently chewing on puffer fish to release a small dose of neurotoxin, then floating at the surface in what looks like a trance. Researchers who study this across species think the pull toward intoxication might sit alongside hunger and thirst as a basic biological drive, not a glitch but a feature, which means when early humans found the same plants everyone else was already eating, they weren't inventing something new, they were just the latest species to notice. So how did we actually find these things? Not in a lab, not through trial and error in a controlled setting. Almost certainly through hunger, desperation, and a whole lot of dead ends. Foraging societies tested everything. Roots, bark, seeds, fungi, leaves. Most of it did nothing. Some of it made people sick. And every so often, someone ate the wrong mushroom or chewed the wrong leaf and the world tilted sideways. That moment, confusing and probably terrifying the first time, would have been impossible to forget, and a species that survives by passing down what works would have passed that down too. Which plant? Which part of it? How much? What happens if you eat too much? That's really the whole story of how humans discovered drugs. Not one invention, but thousands of separate discoveries happening independently on every continent by people who had no contact with each other, all converging on the same basic idea. Certain plants can take you somewhere else. Here's what the evidence actually shows once you start looking. In China and Central Asia, chemical traces of burned cannabis show up in wooden incense burners from around 2500 BC, found at burial sites. At one of those sites, sitting right next to the burners, archaeologists found a harp. Picture that. People gathered at a funeral, mourning, playing music, breathing in a mild psychoactive haze while they grieved. That's not a party, that's a ritual, built with intention, by people who had clearly done this before and knew exactly what they were doing. Roughly 1,000 years earlier, on the island of Menorca off the coast of Spain, someone was doing something far more intense. Hair samples pulled from a sealed cave show regular, sustained use of a nightshade cocktail, ephedrine, atropine, and scopolamine. Compounds that don't ease you in gently. Scopolamine alone is known to produce vivid hallucinations, and what people across history have described as out-of-body experiences. The hair shows use over at least a year, which means whoever this was, likely a shaman or ritual specialist, had turned it into something closer to a discipline than a habit. Someone figured out the right dose, the right preparation, and kept doing it on purpose for their community. Across the Atlantic, coca leaves were being chewed in the Andes as far back as 8,000 years ago, and peyote buttons found in Texas have been carbon dated to roughly 4000 BC. In Mesoamerica, stone carvings depicting mushrooms alongside gods suggest psilocybin use was already deeply embedded in religious life at least 2,500 years ago. In every one of these cases, the discovery process looks the same. Someone eats something out of curiosity or hunger, notices the effect, survives it, and tells someone else. Over generations, that trial and error hardens into knowledge, then into ritual, then into religion. And religion is really where this story goes next, because almost none of the early evidence we have is recreational. The cannabis in China was for communicating with the dead. The peyote was for sacred ceremony. The nightshade cocktail in Spain belonged to a ritual specialist who acted as a go-between for the living and whatever came after. Across cultures that never met, never traded, never shared a word of language, the same idea kept showing up. Take the substance, cross into an altered state, and on the other side, believe you've touched something real. You can take the purely rational position that this was neurologically induced hallucination that people interpreted as spiritual contact, and that's a completely fair reading. But it leaves a question sitting on the table. How did civilizations with zero contact independently land on the exact same method for reaching the divine? Some researchers now argue that psychedelics might not just be connected to early religion. They might be where the entire concept came from. The first time a person came back from an experience like that and said, with complete conviction, there is another world, might be the actual origin point of the sacred. Alcohol tells a slightly different version of the same story, because this one seems to have come from accident rather than deliberate searching. Fruit left too long ferments on its own. Grain left wet in a container ferments on its own. Someone at some point drank the liquid anyway rather than throw it out and found out what happens. Chemical residue from a site in China called Jiaohu shows humans fermenting rice, honey and fruit roughly 9,000 years ago, before writing, before cities, before most of what we associate with civilization. At Rakafet Cave in Israel, evidence of brewing goes back 13,000 years, made by hunter-gatherers who hadn't even settled into permanent villages yet. They were nomadic people, brewing beer in caves, which means the discovery of alcohol may actually predate agriculture. Some archaeologists have gone as far as arguing that the grinding generations-long process of domesticating grain wasn't just about food. It might have been driven, at least partly, by wanting a reliable beer supply. None of this looked like what we picture today. Casual, private, recreational drug use is a genuinely recent invention. For thousands of years, these substances were sacred, tightly controlled, and often restricted to specialists. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians were cultivating opium poppies by 3400 BC and called it hulgul, the joy plant. In Egypt, the blue lotus flower shows up obsessively across thousands of years of temple art, likely soaked in wine to draw out its mild psychoactive properties. And then there's Eleusis. For nearly 2,000 years, thousands of Greeks made an annual pilgrimage to drink a substance called the kykeon, as part of a sacred ceremony. Revealing what happened during the ritual wasn't punished with a fine, it was punished with death. And yet the list of known initiates includes Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Sophocles, the sharpest minds of the ancient world, showing up voluntarily to alter their consciousness in the pursuit of understanding existence itself. In 2020, residue analysis on a drinking vessel from a related Greek site in Spain turned up ergot, a fungus that produces chemical precursors to LSD. That's not speculation. That's a chemical signature from an actual cup. The people doing all of this had brains built exactly like ours. What they built around these substances wasn't primitive superstition. It was accumulated generational knowledge about consciousness itself, tested through centuries of trial and error, refined long before anyone had a word for pharmacology. And that knowledge is having a strange kind of comeback right now. Clinical trials are showing psilocybin can produce lasting relief for treatment-resistant depression. MDMA-assisted therapy is showing real results for PTSD. We spent centuries dismissing all of this as superstition, and now we're spending billions of research dollars carefully rediscovering conclusions a Bronze Age shaman on a Spanish island had already worked out with a handful of nightshade plants and a lot of trial and error. So how did ancient humans actually discover drugs? Not through one flash of insight, but through thousands of individual moments of hunger, curiosity, and accident. Tested and retested until the knowledge became too valuable to lose. Somewhere in a cave in Bolivia 1,000 years ago, someone packed cocaine, DMT, and 3 other compounds into a fox snout pouch and sealed it away in the rock. They knew exactly what each one did. They knew how to combine them, and they left it there, waiting, without ever imagining that someone would find it 1,000 years later and still not fully understand how they figured it all out in the first place. The pharaoh Ramesses III died thinking he'd won. He'd beaten back 2 full-scale invasions by the mysterious Sea Peoples and held Egypt together while the rest of the Bronze Age world was falling apart around him. A collapse so complete it wiped out entire civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean in the space of a generation. If you'd asked anyone in his court who the real danger to Ramesses III was, they'd have pointed east, out toward the coast, toward the ships. They'd have been wrong. The danger was already standing in the room with him. For a long time, historians weren't even sure how Ramesses III actually died. There's a surviving court document called the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, and it describes a detailed plot. One of his secondary wives, a woman named Tyre, wanted her son Pentawa to take the throne instead of the official heir. So she pulled together a team, harem officials, a magician who supposedly made wax figures to sneak weapons past the palace guards, and even some soldiers, to help stage a takeover. The trial records survive in surprising detail. Dozens of people were put to death or forced to end their own lives. What the records don't make clear is whether the murder itself actually worked. That question went unanswered for 3,000 years. Then in 2012, a team of researchers finally put the mummy through a CT scanner, and there it was, hidden under the wrappings for 3,000 years. His throat had been cut so deep the wound reached his spine. Someone had gone for a kill, that decisive on purpose. The plot had worked completely. And it still got them nothing because Pentawa never took the throne. He was executed too, most likely forced to end his own life right alongside his mother's co-conspirators. Everyone who helped kill the king ended up dead as well. Now jump forward about 2,500 years and swap the knife for a locked door. Shah Jahan, the Mughal emperor who built the Taj Mahal, spent the last 8 years of his life locked up in Agra Fort, put there by his own son. It's worth pausing on how strange that is. This was a man who'd used the wealth of one of the richest empires on earth to build a tomb for his dead wife. A project so over the top, it's still one of the most recognised buildings on the planet 400 years later. When he got seriously sick in 1657, his 4 sons didn't wait around to see if he'd get better. They went straight to war with each other over who would take his place. The winner, a son named Aurangzeb, didn't just beat his brothers. He had at least one of them killed and sent the head to their father as proof. Then he locked Shah Jahan away in a fort with one cruel little detail, a balcony that looks straight out at the Taj Mahal. The man who built the most famous monument to love in human history spent the rest of his life staring at it from a cell his own son had built for him. Aurangzeb went on to rule for almost 50 years and pushed the Mughal Empire to the biggest size it ever reached. By some measures, he came out on top. But it's hard to miss that the empire he took over through betrayal started falling apart not long after he died. Partly because he'd spent decades showing everyone around him exactly how this family handled a change of power. Ramesses lost his throat to his own wife. Shah Jahan lost his freedom to his own son. Suleiman the Magnificent, probably the most powerful ruler on earth in the 1500s, in charge of land stretching from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, lost his son to his own wife. Suleiman had a favourite son, Mustafa, from an earlier relationship. Mustafa was capable and popular, a skilled military leader, and pretty much everyone, Ottoman officials, foreign visitors, the public, assumed he'd be the next sultan. Then there was Hurrem Sultan, Suleiman's legal wife, whose own sons had basically no shot at the throne, as long as Mustafa was alive and doing well. Most historians agree Hurrem spent years quietly working to turn Suleiman against Mustafa, likely with help from her son-in-law, a powerful official who controlled a lot of what actually reached the Sultan's ears. In 1553, Suleiman called Mustafa to his military camp, supposedly to talk about an upcoming campaign. Mustafa reportedly suspected exactly what was waiting for him there, but he went anyway because refusing a direct order from the Sultan would have looked like he was already starting a rebellion. He was strangled inside his own father's tent, on his father's orders, based mostly on suspicions his stepmother had spent years planting. One account from the time even claims Suleiman watched the whole thing from behind a screen. It worked in the narrowest sense. Hurrem's son Selim did end up on the throne eventually. History remembers him as Selim the Sot, a ruler with little interest in actually governing, and generally seen as one of the weaker sultans during the empire's strongest era. Hurrem got exactly the outcome she'd spent years working for. It's just not clear the empire came out ahead because of it. If you want the strangest version of this pattern though, you have to go to Rome. Because Nero didn't just get betrayed by his blood, he was made emperor by it, and then he killed the person who made him emperor. Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, is one of the most ruthless political operators in Roman history. She married the Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, convinced him to adopt her teenage son Nero ahead of his own biological son, and, according to several ancient sources, eventually poisoned Claudius with a plate of mushrooms once Nero's position was secure enough to take the throne. She didn't just want her son to be emperor, she wanted to run the empire through him. For the first few years, that's more or less what happened. Nero was young and Agrippina controlled access to him, controlled his advisors, and expected to control his decisions. But as Nero settled into power, he wanted his mother's grip loosened, not tightened. He started sidelining her from official business. She responded, according to Roman historians, by threatening to back a rival claim to the throne instead, reportedly her own stepson, Britannicus, Claudius's actual biological son, who she'd helped push aside years earlier and could now, in theory, push back into the picture as leverage. Britannicus died suddenly not long after, at a dinner, in front of guests, poisoned, most ancient sources agree, on Nero's order. The son used the same method the mother had used to get him the throne in the first place, this time to remove the last person who could threaten his hold on it. That still left Agrippina herself. Roman sources describe an almost absurd sequence of attempts on her life, including most famously a self-sinking boat, engineered to collapse and drown her at sea, which she survived by swimming to shore. Nero eventually gave up on subtlety and simply sent soldiers to kill her directly. One account claims that when the assassin raised his sword, Agrippina told him to strike her in the stomach first, the womb that had carried the son who was now having her killed. Nero ruled for another decade after that, but his reign is remembered as increasingly erratic, and he ended it by taking his own life as Roman armies turned against him. The woman who'd committed murder to put him on the throne, and the son who'd committed murder to get her off it, were both gone within 14 years of each other, and neither death did much to secure what either of them had actually wanted. Peter the Great ran into this same problem from the other side, not as the one being plotted against, but as the one who had to decide what to do about the plot. His son and heir, Alexei, disagreed with almost everything his father believed in. The push to modernize Russia along Western lines, the constant wars, the brand new capital city being built up out of a swamp. Where Peter wanted a modern, outward-looking Russia, Alexei wanted things to go back to the old ways, and he had plenty of traditionalist supporters who agreed with him. Eventually, Alexei did something no loyal heir is supposed to do. He fled the country completely, running to the Habsburgs for protection, essentially defecting from his own father's empire. Peter lured him back home with promises of forgiveness, then immediately put him on trial for treason. Alexei was tortured until he gave a confession that implicated several people, including his own mother, and he was sentenced to death. He never actually made it to his execution. He died in prison just a few days after the sentence was handed down, under circumstances that were unclear even at the time. Officially, it was the after effects of the torture, but rumours of something more direct never really went away. There's a strange loop here. A son who betrayed his father's entire vision simply by wanting no part of it, and a father who responded by treating his own child exactly like any other threat to his rule. Peter had reshaped an entire country through sheer force of will. He couldn't reshape his own son into someone who actually wanted the throne he was about to inherit. And when he couldn't, he chose the empire over his own child. 5 rulers, 5 centuries, 5 completely different methods. A slit throat hidden under bandages for 3,000 years. A father staring out at his dead wife's tomb from inside a prison cell. A son strangled in his own father's tent because of a stepmother's whispers. A mother asking to be stabbed in the womb that bore the son who ordered her death. A father who let his own son be tortured to death rather than risk letting him take the throne. But underneath all of it sits the same brutal math. When a throne only has room for one person, and the people standing closest to it share your blood, that closeness stops being safety. It becomes the opposite, which might explain something that seems a little strange on the surface. Why so many of history's best defended rulers, men and women who'd survived wars, invasions, and assassination attempts, ended up keeping the people who loved them least right next to the throne, while pushing the people who might have actually loved them as far from any claim to it as possible. Ramesses III's cracked, mummified throat is still on display in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, if you ever want to see it for yourself. And Shah Jahan's balcony is still there in Agra Fort too. You can stand in the exact same spot he stood, and look out at the exact same view he was forced to look at for 8 years until he died. Today we're taking a deep dive into the most terrifying sea creatures ever dreamed up by sailors who had every reason to be afraid of the water. Number 1, the Kraken. Off the coast of Norway in the 1700s, sailors kept returning with the same account. Calm water, a whirlpool forming out of nowhere. Then the sea itself beginning to rise. In 1755, Bishop Eric Pontoppidan gave the creature its first official record, describing something so massive its back could be mistaken for a chain of small islands over a mile across. Some fishermen claimed the kraken was so large that its arrival brought fish up from the deep with it, making the surrounding waters unusually easy to fish. Right before the ship anchored, they vanished completely. Ships that stumbled onto a real kraken rarely got a second chance. Massive limbs would rise out of the calm and wrap around the hull, dragging the vessel under, whole, and by the time anyone on shore noticed, there was nothing left to explain where the crew had gone. Sailors avoided entire stretches of ocean for decades, convinced the creature was still down there, waiting for the next ship to get too close. Number 2, Scylla. In Greek mythology, sailors navigating the Strait of Messina faced an impossible choice. On one side of the narrow channel waited Charybdis, a whirlpool that could swallow an entire ship. On the other side waited something worse. Scylla had once been a beautiful nymph, until the sorceress Circe, driven by jealousy, poisoned the waters where she bathed and transformed her into a monster with 6 heads, each mounted on a long serpentine neck, and 12 legs dangling uselessly beneath her. She made her home in a cave high on the cliffside, low enough to strike at passing ships. When a vessel came within reach, all 6 heads would lunge at once, each one seizing a sailor and swallowing him whole while his crewmates watched, helpless to stop it. Homer's Odyssey describes Odysseus choosing to sail closer to Scylla rather than risk Charybdis, accepting the loss of 6 men as the price of survival. It's one of the earliest recorded examples of a captain doing the math on how many people he could afford to lose, and just how cold that decision really is once you're the one making it. Number 3, Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent. In Norse mythology, Jörmungandr wasn't just a sea monster, it was the sea itself, in a sense. Born to the trickster god Loki and the giantess Angerboda, the serpent was cast into the ocean by Odin as an infant, banished for the threat the gods believed it would one day pose. Instead of dying, it grew. It grew so large that it eventually circled the entire world, gripping its own tail in its mouth, holding the oceans together at the edge of everything. Sailors who ventured too far from shore told stories of massive coils breaking the surface, long enough to be mistaken for a chain of reefs, right before the water around them began to move on its own. Norse legend holds that Jörmungandr and the god Thor were fated enemies from the beginning, destined to meet only once at Ragnarok, the end of the world. When that day comes, Thor will finally kill the serpent, only to stagger 9 steps and collapse, poisoned by its venom. 2 ancient enemies born for a single fight, and neither one walks away from it. Number 4, the Sirens. Not every monster needed claws or teeth. In Greek mythology, the Sirens killed with something far harder to defend against, their voices. Half woman, half bird, the Sirens perched on a rocky island surrounded by the wreckage of every ship that had ever sailed close enough to hear them sing. Their song was said to promise sailors exactly what they most wanted to hear: glory, knowledge, the comfort of home, and it was impossible to resist once you were within range. Men would abandon their posts, dive into the water, and swim toward the voices without a second thought. only to be torn apart on the rocks below or drowned before they ever reached the shore. When Odysseus sailed past their island, he ordered his crew to plug their ears with wax and had himself tied to the mast, desperate to hear the song and survive it. He screamed at his men to release him. They didn't. It's one of the only stories where a monster never had to move an inch, because the real danger was never the sirens themselves. It was what people were willing to do once they heard them. Number 5. Umibozu. In Japanese folklore, not every sea monster announced itself with violence. Umibozu, whose name translates roughly to sea monk, was known for something far quieter and to sailors far more unsettling. On nights when the ocean had gone completely still, a massive black shape would begin to rise out of the water without a sound. No splash, no warning, just a smooth, hairless dome breaking the surface, sometimes described as taller than the mast of the ship itself. Fishermen who encountered it said the air would grow cold, and the sea around the boat would go dead silent, as if the water itself were holding its breath. Some accounts claim Umibozu would simply stare at the vessel before sinking back beneath the waves. Others say it demanded a barrel from the crew, and if given one without a bottom, would use it to fill the ship with water until it sank. Sailors along the Japanese coast developed a specific ritual for calm nights, keeping a hollow barrel ready at all times, just in case the sea went still and something enormous decided to rise. Number 6. The Ningen. Unlike the others on this list, the Ningen doesn't come from ancient mythology. It comes from modern fishing crews working the freezing waters of the Southern Ocean near Antarctica, an area so remote and hostile that almost nobody is out there to see anything at all. Reports describe a massive humanoid figure, pale white, sometimes estimated at over 20 metres long, with a smooth, featureless face and limbs that end in what witnesses describe as fins or flippers rather than hands. Most sightings happen at night or in heavy fog, glimpsed just below the surface or briefly breaking it before disappearing again without so much as a ripple. No photograph has ever confirmed it. No body has ever been recovered, despite decades of rumours circulating among crews who work that stretch of ocean. And that's part of what makes it different from every other creature on this list. The Ningen isn't a story passed down for centuries. It's a rumour still spreading right now, reported by people with modern boats, modern instruments, and no obvious reason to lie. Whether it's a genuine unknown species, a misidentified whale, or something else entirely, sightings continue to come out of the Southern Ocean to this day. Number 7. The Bunyip. In Aboriginal Australian folklore, the bunyip doesn't live in the ocean. It lives in the swamps, rivers, and billabongs scattered across the outback, waiting in murky water for anyone careless enough to wander too close after dark. Descriptions vary wildly between different Aboriginal groups. Some say it has tusks, others a horse-like head, others feathers or a tail like a seal. What stays consistent across almost every telling is the sound. Witnesses describe a deep booming cry echoing across still water right before someone goes missing near the shoreline. Early European settlers heard the stories from local communities and soon started reporting their own encounters. Strange bellowing at night, unexplained tracks pressed into the mud, livestock found dead near the water's edge for no clear reason. Parents used the bunyip to keep children away from dangerous water, and it worked because entire communities avoided certain billabongs for generations, passing the warning down long after anyone could remember exactly why. Something, they were certain, was still down there, waiting for the next person who got too close. Number 8. The Gloucester Sea Serpent. In August of 1817, the harbour town of Gloucester, Massachusetts became the site of one of the most well-documented sea monster sightings in American history. Over several weeks, dozens of witnesses, fishermen, ship captains, and ordinary townspeople reported seeing a massive serpent moving through the harbour, its body rising and falling above the water in a series of humps as it swam. Estimates of its length ranged from 60 to over 100 feet. Some witnesses claimed to have fired at it directly, watching their shots do nothing as the creature simply submerged and resurfaced somewhere else entirely, unbothered. The sightings were taken seriously enough that the Linnean Society of New England formed a committee to investigate, collecting sworn testimony from multiple witnesses independently, all describing strikingly similar details down to the number and shape of the humps. No body was ever found, no conclusive evidence was ever produced, but unlike the myths that came before it, this wasn't a story passed down from centuries earlier. It happened in broad daylight in a harbour full of people, and nobody involved ever recanted what they saw.